evening or good afternoon to everyone. My name is Judith Bernhardt, and our research topic is going to be postpartum depression in new mothers during COVID-19. We are happy to welcome you to our presentation. And first of all, we want to let you know what postpartum depression actually is, so that you have the fundamentals to understand what we will be talking about in our presentation.
But first, really quickly, let's do some introductions. My name is Mabel Tan.
My name is Andrea Ramirez.
My name is Marie-Christine Beinke.
My name is Tristan Watson.
Siri?
Postpartum depression is a form of major depression. 70% of new mothers experience the baby blues, but postpartum depression is different in that it is emotionally and physically debilitating. Symptoms include feelings of extreme sadness, indifference and/or anxiety, and changes in energy, sleep, and appetite. There are roughly 600,000 diagnoses per year, or 1 in 7 women develop postpartum depression after giving birth. PPD can also negatively impact the child and can cause feeding and sleeping problems for the baby. Major risk factors that stimulate PPD include single marital status, unplanned or unwanted pregnancy, a low socioeconomic status, or lack of social support.
Now we are going to present you our specific research question.
Which is, how does social isolation due to the lockdown in the COVID-19 pandemic affect the risk of postpartum depression in recent mothers?
Impact of question. COVID-19 is a current global pandemic that forced pregnant women and new mothers into social isolation. Higher prevalences of postpartum depression, aka PPD, due to social isolation may negatively affect the developing of children born during the pandemic. Postpartum depression is one of the most disabling disorders of women in their childbearing years.
What is the impact of postpartum depression on children? Postpartum depression is considered to be a risk factor that can have negative impact on the child's development. Nevertheless, the intensity of its impact highly depends on the individual case and its circumstances. It is important to pay attention to the fact whether the mother is receiving social support, for example, by her partner, her family, a therapist, or other specialized social institutions. Another aspect is the mother's ability to handle her symptoms in a way that is minimalizing postpartum depression's impact on the mother-child relationship. This also depends on the duration of postpartum depression and the intensity of the symptoms. In this regard, it is necessary to differentiate between the experience of postpartum blues, a postpartum psychosis, or a postpartum depression. There are also factors of the baby, like its temperament and its resilience, that affect the disease progression. It can be said that there is a wide spectrum of social, emotional, and cognitive troubles that children might face due to the mother's postpartum depression. Some children can still experience a normal development, while others face many social, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, and academic difficulties that extend into adolescence. During their development, some children show, for example, less creative play, lower IQ scores, attention deficits, hyperactivity and learning disorders, anxiety, depression, as well as substance and alcohol dependency. The studies that we worked with showed contradictory approaches how to deal with the topic postpartum depression in general. Some pointed out that it is extremely difficult, if not even impossible, to examine the exact influence that postpartum depression has on child development because of several other factors that influence that forms the conditions for growing up, like, for example, economical, infrastructural, and cultural factors, as well as the media. Another study highlighted that it should be the imperative to clarify the effects of postpartum depression on child development, because usually Mothers create the infant's social environment and controls or coordinates their social experiences. It needs to be said that the studies we found seem to be too out of date to come to a more precise conclusion about what the actual effects of postpartum depression is on the child development. Most of them got published shortly after the World Health Organization published a literature review of risk factors and interventions about postpartum depression in 2003.
Now this will lead us to giving you some background information on our topic.
What is known? Social support is needed and is crucial for new mothers to balance a healthy life and helps lower the risk of new mothers developing postpartum depression. It can also last a lifelong if it's not treated or sought out. The development of children can be impacted by their mother's postpartum depression. Giving birth during the pandemic has led to higher stress levels in mothers. What is unknown? The exact postpartum depression rates are unknown because women tend to suffer alone and not reach out to others. Also, the exact effects of the pandemic on these rates are hard to determine.
In our research, we found that there was a similar study done on suicide rates rather than on postpartum depression rates. It is long known that increased social isolation leads to increase in suicide rates. So the scientists predicted that these suicide rates were going to increase due to COVID-19, for example, social distancing and unemployment stresses. The study found that there were overall more than 49,000 additional suicides based on conservative estimates. Since depression and suicide are very closely intertwined, we can extend this to assume a similar result for postpartum depression rates.
Now this leads us to our experimental design, but before presenting you our exact concept, it is important for you to understand each of our 3 utilized screening tools. The first one would be the Interpersonal Support Evaluation List, or shortly ISL-12. This is a 12-item questionnaire used to measure 3 dimensions of perceived social support. These 3 dimensions are appraisal support, belonging support, and tangible support. Also, this is actually the shortened version of the original ISL, which is 40 items. Our second screening tool would be the UCLA Loneliness Scale. This is a 20-item scale designed to measure one's subjective feelings of loneliness, as well as feelings of social isolation. And lastly, we would utilize the Edenworth Postnatal Depression Scale, which is a 10-item scale, which is a 10-item questionnaire developed to assist in identifying possible symptoms of postpartum depression. Here, women are asked to answer each question in terms of the past 7 days. And in the end, there is a score calculated by adding the individual items for each question. If the score is 13 or above 13, it is an indication for developing postpartum depression. And it is also important to say and verify that this is not a diagnostic tool, but rather it is a screening tool. And the aim here is only to identify women who may benefit from follow-up care. And now this leads us to our actual concept, which includes 5 steps. So firstly, we would limit our experiment to 2,000 mothers in total on an international basis. Secondly, these participants would be divided into 2 separate groups. The first group would include 1,000 mothers who gave birth during the pandemic, but without having a strict lockdown in the area. And the second group would consist of 1,000 mothers who gave birth, especially during strict lockdowns. Next up, and in order to collect the data of our participants, we would utilize our 3 screening tools, which I have explained to you beforehand. So the ISL-12, the UCLA Loneliness Scale, and the Edenworth Postnatal Depression Scale. So all of our participants would have to fill out these 3 questionnaires. Next up, we would compare the different results, especially looking at both separate groups, in order to later on interpret the results. So we would specifically look for a correlation between social support or social isolation and postpartum depression rates. And this would give us the ability to get an idea of how the prevalence of postpartum depression has actually changed due to an increase of social isolation. And then we could also compare these new rates of postpartum depression with pre-pandemic rates.
We have three hypotheses for the outcome of our methods. 1. We hypothesize that PPD rates will increase, as demonstrated in the Edenworth postnatal depression scale. 2. We hypothesize that PPD rates will increase because of a decrease in social support due to social distancing, as shown in the ISCL-12 and UCLA studies. And 3, we hypothesize that, in the long run, increased PPD rates will lead to worse developmental outcome in children. And we want to further this proposal to do a long-term study to observe the kids' development.
Now we are going to give you some insights on the considerations that we made.
What are the limitations? The experimental design leads to generalization of PPD patients, since we do not differentiate between differences in ethnicity, nationality, social, cultural backgrounds, aka international study. The experiment design does not differentiate between different types of PPD. We cannot determine the exact individual causes leading to developing PPD.
And as with any experiment, there will be arguments refuting our results. One of these possible arguments may be that the PPD we observed may be due to other factors such as unemployment, rather than just because of social distancing from COVID-19. However, this is exactly why we carried out our ISIL and UCLA questionnaires, so we can make sure that this is in fact due to social distancing and lack of social support. Another argument may be that some may be experiencing other mental disorders, for example, anxiety, which may be confused with postpartum depression, as the Edenworth scale cannot differentiate between the two. Our anticipated findings are that we expect to see a notable increase in postpartum depression rates in women who gave birth during a strict lockdown versus without a strict lockdown. And if participants were followed for several years to monitor child development, we expect to see higher than normal rates of negative child development.
Of course, we also considered legal, ethical, and social implications. I will start with the legal implications. Firstly, our experiment should only be conducted under the consideration of good clinical practice, which is an international quality standard. And this is to ensure that the research will not cause any negative legal implications, which can also be seen as an ethical point as well. Secondly, it must be ensured that participants give their consent and that necessary precautions are taken during data and clinical research publications. And lastly, our research publications must not duplicate other existing publications, since this can lead to the violation of copyright laws. And this practice could also artificially enlarge one's scientific work and may give an undue advantage when it comes to competing for research funding or career advancement.
Along with legal implications, there are social implications present as well. There is possible stigma surrounding women who gave birth during COVID-19 and their children, despite the fact that there are children who develop normally even though their mothers have PPD. Cultural backgrounds obviously differ from mother to mother, which leads to everyone's view on mental health being different. Focusing on PPD as a risk factor for positive child development could lead to the stigma that women having PPD cannot be good mothers, which can lead to shaming, teasing, and through research, even suicide. And the biggest, most impactful social implication is that we will be able to diagnose more cases of PPD and provide mothers with the care and resources that they need.
Now, of course, we have our ethical implications as well. If all three of our hypotheses are proven to be true, then we have an ethical obligation to increase support available to mitigate the effect of postpartum depression during these times. We need to be able to provide more resources for mothers suffering from postpartum depression.
Now we have come to the end of our presentation, and we hope that we caught your interest, and we want to thank you very much for your time and for listening to us.
All right, well done, you guys. I'm so impressed. I
Go ahead.
will.
No worries.
Now-
Absolutely excellent, guys. I mean, that was wonderful. It was a really, really good multinational cooperation, which was outstanding. Each one of you jumped in and handled your part with just great capability, real insight to the literature. And what I really liked is that you framed what you were doing in context of other studies, including at the very end, addressing the need for responsible conduct of your research to make sure that it was done with full consent, with good institutional review and good clinical practices, and also that you assess the research so that it wouldn't have any plagiaristic impact. But you did that in such a way that was also important to how that might sustain the viability for funding, which was, I mean, really brilliant, because it's such a mature concept that is so important when you're getting into leading the field. And what that means is actually getting the funding for it. I just thought it was excellent. I won't belabor this other than to simply applaud and think it was wonderful. I'd like to hand it over, please, to my colleagues. I'd like to have Dr. Würtzman, I'd like to have Ms. Thompson, and I'd like to have Professor Dr. Coles, please.
I'm not sure if Dr. Wurzman's connection is working right now.
Okay, no
Perhaps we
worries.
can defer to Ms. Thompson and see if Dr. Wurzman's works in a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Sure, I'll go ahead. Very good job, folks. Again, tying this to COVID specifically makes it very timely and very relevant. And not the first presentation we've seen that's tied to COVID. And I think it's always really important to make sure that your research has a direct audience, is something that is relevant to the population at large. That being said, my first thought was, given that I myself have never had children, my initial thought was, what does this mean to me? And I think it means something to everybody. It would have been helpful, I think, at the beginning of your presentation to explain the overall social impact of the problem, because it's not just an issue for the mother and the baby. This has widespread socioeconomic impact, social structure impact, social services, other caregivers, members of their support system. This is affecting everybody in ways that a lot of these things are really kind of intangible. But even things like the child who's struggling in school at age 5 or age 10, how is that impacting his classmates? So I think pulling all of those other pieces together, this is an issue that affects all of us. I would tie that in and make that really clear. One thing I would find really interesting is your study looked at women who gave birth during the pandemic lockdown. I'd be really interested to know how many of them became pregnant before the lockdown and then gave birth during the lockdown versus how many of them got pregnant during the lockdown. That is, who knew going into pregnancy, this is the situation, versus how many got pregnant, say, December 2019, then the lockdown happened, and then it was a matter of, oh my gosh, what's happening here? So were they in some ways less mentally prepared for giving birth during the pandemic, and would they have maybe suffered more of an impact as a result of that lack of mental preparation? Just some of my thoughts off the top of my head, but overall I thought very well done, very timely, very cohesive, and very well researched. So good job.
Nico, over to you, my friend.
Okay, yeah, that was brilliant. I mean, as a matter of fact, I was listening very carefully, given that I have a PhD student at the moment who is doing exactly what you're aiming at. This lady is actually trying to develop an app for mothers who, so as to prevent the depression from the depression after birth giving, and it has been a topic that has been overlooked, like many others. And I can only say what we as Western societies, let me put it that way, do. We don't pay careful attention to the beginning of life as well as to the end of life. And I think this needs to be rectified. And you have done a very, very carefully considered step, research-wise, to tackle that problem. This is brilliant. And on a personal note, being a father of 2 children and having been in a foreign country, when I was in the UK, when my first child, my son, was born, I can only sympathize and say that this is a very difficult time, particularly when you are in a changed context and you don't know about the whereabouts and the do's and don'ts. So this is very, very timely, and it's much needed. And what has impressed me most is the fact that you have all carefully worked together. You have gathered from international, from different backgrounds. You've tackled the problem. You've very, very, very carefully, at least as far as I can see, very carefully looked at the literature, and that was just straight through the problem. I think this is what needs to be done, and I can only say that if I had a chance to give you money, I would hand it over to you and say, go for it. I mean, clearly there's a lot of motivation, a lot of heart blood, and everything went into this research proposal, and this was clearly visible. So hands up for you from Germany. Great job, guys. Brilliant. I'm very, very proud.
We have connection with Dr. Würzmann.
I'm afraid I just got in touch with her and she is still having internet issues.
Okay, that's good. Professor Dr. Heinrich, you want to jump in?
Yes, I would like to say I'm not a medical specialist in contrast to Jim or Nico, but I also think it's an invisible issue, but it's a very important issue for society. So it's very creditable that you took it up and treated it. I think the presentation was brilliantly laid out. It was beautifully structured, and it was very comprehensible for us all, I think. So hooray for that. And also I would support Mrs. Thompson in that the problem highlights a normal issue too. It's not only confined to COVID times, but it's a problem in normal times too, because all the normal structures, the societal structures, they fall apart normally. We have many mothers with no husband, and all the family connections break up, you know, so there is probably no parents near the mother. So this is a problem. This is next door to everybody, to any one of us. And normally we don't see it, you know, it's invisible. So it's very important to address it, and you did that. So this was very creditable. So many thanks for that.
Let me add to this, if I may. I think every society would actually benefit from the fact that they would take care of the mother and the child for the first 3 years, so as to allow them to build a bondage, and both on a neurophysiological and on a psychological and on a psychosocial basis. And that would actually allow the child to build those circuits that are most important for building up self-regulation capacities. And every society, regardless of whatever the system is, would actually benefit tremendously from it. And I think you have done, what you have shown is that this is researchable, with good and rigorous methodological efforts, and I think this really needs to be applauded. So thank you very much. This was just brilliant. I think you've done a very important step. Go on, continue with that. It's really, really important.
All right.